Pandemic had a lot of effects on journalism. On the good side, demand for information and quality information rose dramatically. So, in England, they started to realize how important the BBC was, for example. And many newspapers started giving away free coverage online of COVID. So there was a lot of demand and there was a lot of appetite, but unfortunately, there was a further decline in revenues. And of course, journalism had already been in trouble in many places, especially local news, because they'd been losing advertisers and getting subscriptions to offset that loss. Some places it was possible, some places it wasn't. So the pandemic exacerbated many of these problems, and there were as we started researching the report, we saw that there were layoffs and outlets closing really all over the world. Even in places like Bolivia, journalists were losing their jobs. And it got so bad that that some people started saying this was going to be a media extinction event. And in Southern Africa, Tivinyane said that he was really worried that a lot of newspaper outlets would just close. And this would really matter because then there wouldn't actually be quality information available to many people. What happened was Konrad Adenauer Foundation came to me over the summer and asked if I'd like to research what was happening to journalists. And I said, you know what? Rather than write another depressing report about the problems, which we all know, let's just cut to the chase, as they used to say in Hollywood, and let's just look at the solutions. So I got a few of my students to help me, and it was incredible how much creative energy and good ideas we saw around the world. And we spoke to Nishant Lalwani, who does media grant making for Luminate Foundation. And he said, they really fall into about 4 categories. So we wrote the report about the different solutions that we were seeing. So some were pretty obvious, like Google and Facebook started giving grants to news outlets. And, that was a great thing to do. And there were many countries like in Latin America where we really couldn't find any government support that, or an increase in government support. So, $15,000 from Google, that helps a lot. And people were really glad to get it. There were a lot of other grant making, and they were all overwhelmed. People would say, hey, I've got $30,000 and they get hundreds of applications. So that was like sort of one category, was the sort of private initiatives. And there were also attempts to sort of scale up and coordinate. Then a second category was government support. And that really excited us because we saw in, the usual suspects, Australia, Norway, Europe, Canada, lots of money was getting put out as part of the general COVID relief funds. They were putting out a lot of money just to help media outlets survive, quality journalism survive, and even freelancers survive. And if you look at the Singapore government website, they say, hey, we're doing this because we need quality information. So it's a real understanding. So that was exciting too. What was sort of surprising and incredible to us was that in the US, where journalists always said, we don't like the government, we don't trust the government, keep away from the government, we now have several laws in Congress to help support local news. So they're a whole different in the report. I won't go into details here, but looking at things that that lots of other countries have been doing and that you can do, like vouchers and tax credits and, helping journalists become nonprofit. So that was exciting to see all that new energy around possible lawmaking. And then there were a few other projects that really excited us, but I guess maybe I'll just finish by saying we were really taken with what Australia is doing. So just to back up a minute, in many countries around the world, well, really in Europe, Spain, France, Germany, have said, hey, Google and Facebook, especially Google, should pay for news that they use. And Europe passed a copyright directive saying if you're going to use bits of our news, got to pay for it. We're got to pay more for it. We're got to bargain with the companies, the news outlets to do it. And Google's just refused. And they just haven't paid the money. So what Australia did was something different, which was they said, we're not going to use copyright law. We are going to use competition law. There is an imbalance of power between the tech companies and the news outlets, and we need to rectify that imbalance. And Google and Facebook have to pay for news, or rather, they have to negotiate with the publishers. And if they can't agree, then we will have binding arbitration panels that will decide the price. So this is a totally new way of approaching this big problem. And it's been interesting to see that other countries are watching Australia quite closely to see whether they will be able to emulate what Australia is doing. And Google and Facebook pushed back very hard. And, throughout the fall, we're saying things like, well, we're not going to cover local news anymore. And, this is really going to be terrible. And it's been quite contentious, but the government, as it does, had a sort of commenting period, discussion period about the law, and they amended it and they introduced it to Parliament in December. And we're expecting that it will be passed probably sometime in the next couple of months. So I thought it was a sort of interesting, creative approach to a problem we've all been worried about, which is how do you finance journalism? I think that because the problems are so big, we really need to look at the big solutions. So I think that, it's long past time to get Google and Facebook to pay way more towards news. I think that we need government support for news, obviously, with guidelines. And I really think that instead of sort of funding new startups, it's much better to protect whatever quality information we already have. So I really like Steve Waldman's approach in the US. He's got something called the Transplanting Project, because he says there are 6,700 local news sites that have been bought by hedge funds, private equity people. And normally these guys just strip everything out, hollow it out, strip off the assets, take short-term profit. So his idea is to find funding to actually buy those outlets and then turn them into, could be anything like a local nonprofit or owned by a school or something like that. So to me, the lessons of the report are we have to think big. We have to try to bring in, government as well as private sectors as much as possible, have to really scale, have to learn from each other, and really prioritize solutions that will solve the problem longer term. That was really, I think, the lesson of our research.